The following resolution. Whereas Ken Johnston has served as a town councillor for 8 years representing the citizens of Ward 1 in Pictou, Nova Scotia, and whereas Ken has worked hard as a town councillor and as a result has helped make the town of Pictou a better place to live and work, and whereas the people of Pictou thank Ken in recognition and appreciation for his years of dedicated service to the town of Pictou, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulates Ken Johnston for his 8 years of service to the town of Pictou and wishes him every success in his future endeavours. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day. Oral questions put by members to Minister. The time is now 3:20. We will finish at 4:50. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Premier told reporters that he's achieved all of his campaign commitments, Mr. Speaker, except for balancing the budget. The Premier failed to admit that his government missed another key economic commitment, Mr. Speaker, from his A Genuine Plan for Today's Family. The NDP campaign document stated, and I quote, "We'll create 2,200 jobs per year through our 10% manufacturing and processing investment tax credit," end of quote. Mr. Speaker, our manufacturing sector has lost jobs since the NDP government has taken office. So my question for the Minister of Economic and Rural Development: why has the NDP government failed to increase the number of jobs in the manufacturing sector as originally promised?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've been standing here in my place for the last couple of weeks explaining that we've created 7,600 jobs, Mr. Speaker, in the last year. Mr. Speaker, I don't know what more I can say. We are creating jobs. The Jobs Here strategy is working, and we will continue to stand by the plan that we've got laid out for the future of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, that same NDP campaign document said the NDP, and I quote, would create the secure jobs Nova Scotians' economy needs, end of quote. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia has lost 3,500 full-time jobs since the NDP have taken office, but, Mr. Speaker, it has gained about 13,000 part-time jobs since they've taken office, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Minister: why does the government think a part-time job is a good for the economy of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, it's obviously I'm not able to get through to the Leader of the Opposition, so I'm going to toss that question over to the Premier. Maybe he'll have better luck.
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've said this earlier, but I'll say it again for the benefit of the Leader of the Opposition. Statistics Canada from June of 2009 through to October 2012 shows that there have been 7,600 additional jobs created in Nova Scotia. And, Mr. Speaker, there is so much more that this government has done over that time. We have won the largest industrial contract in the history of this province, some 11,000 jobs, Mr. Speaker. And, unfortunately, the attitude of the Leader of the Opposition, he thinks this is funny, and I think it is just the ignorance and inexperience of the Leader of the Opposition, where he refuses to understand the real prospects for long-term employment for the province, and he should be congratulating Irving, IBM, Projects, all of the companies that are coming here to Nova Scotia to build our future.
Order, please. Order, please. I would remind the honourable member that the word ignorance is unparliamentary. It is. And I would ask the honourable member to retract it, please.
I can replace it with arrogance.
Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition. And his final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the same NDP campaign document says, and I quote, "We ensure more young people stay and build a life here in Nova Scotia," end of quote. Since this government has taken office, Mr. Speaker, we have lost 4,000 young Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. We have lost them because we have seen employment for young Nova Scotians drop by that 4,000, Mr. Speaker, and full-time employment drop by 6,900, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, so this government has failed to meet its own manufacturing job targets, Mr. Speaker, failed to create the secure jobs, Mr. Speaker, and failed to keep our young people here, Mr. Speaker. So my question for the Minister of Economic and Rural Development, why has his jobs strategy failed so miserably for Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will answer the question. Mr. Speaker, I want a table for you, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism. The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. See, unfortunately, the Leader of the Opposition doesn't want, he's afraid of a debate on this issue, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to... And he demonstrates not only his lack of respect, but his disrespect for the people of this province, Mr. Speaker. Through his actions, he thinks this is funny. Well, it's not funny, Mr. Speaker. I want to table for the House the headline on the Chronicle Herald that says extraordinary opportunity for Nova Scotia. This is about the IBM deal, Mr. Speaker. Today, Mr. Speaker, and I don't want to be accused of using this as a prop, but today I have the business section of the Chronicle Herald. Clearwater rides high on a rising tide. Costs soar as construction boom continues in Halifax, Mr. Speaker. The next page. Cherubini expansion takes shape, Mr. Speaker. These are all success stories about the province of Nova Scotia and the economy. Mr. Speaker, this is the manufacturing tax credit at work. This is the Jobs Here program at work. This is what the Leader of the Opposition refuses to admit, that the province of Nova Scotia, that the young people in Nova Scotia are better off today with the NDP government and the work that we're doing.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if there was ever any doubt that the Premier only manages to the headlines in the Chronicle Herald and nothing else, that last answer was it. Unfortunately, Nova Scotians continue to ask how many hundreds of millions of their money have they paid for the Premier to quote that headline. That is the issue before the House today, Mr. Speaker. In fact, going back to March of this year, the Premier provided over $300 million in financial assistance to the Irvings. Mr. Speaker, that was right around the time that he spent $620,000 of taxpayers' money trying to take credit for their win of the shipyard contract. This is all part of the $500 million he's given away to large companies to try and quote headlines once in a while like the ones he's using here today in this House. So my question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, is will he now immediately and finally release the details of his financial gift to the Irving Group for this House and for all Nova Scotians to see?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I realize that in the Progressive Conservative Party, they don't recognize headlines like that because they never saw them when they were in power. So, Mr. Speaker, I understand that that's very difficult for them to try and understand. What they should know about the support for the Irving contract is two things. First of all, had we not supported the contract, that contract would have went to Quebec, would have went to British Columbia, and all of that opportunity, that the 10,000 or 11,000 jobs identified by the Conference Board of Canada would have went somewhere else. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, the support to the Irving Company is a commercial loan. on commercial terms, which they can only earn forgiveness of, if they create the jobs that are demanded. And then, Mr. Speaker, they would have had to have created more than $2 billion in tax revenue for the province of Nova Scotia to go into health care, into education, into roads, into housing. Mr. Speaker, that's a good deal for Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you something that we recognize over here, and that is a Premier that says one thing when he's running for office and the exact opposite when he's the Premier of Nova Scotia. That's what we recognize. When that member was in opposition, he said to the Daily News at the time, and I'll quote from the member opposite, who is now our Premier, in 1998, he said, "We want there to be support for the shipbuilding industry. What we don't want is to see a backroom deal that's cooked up and that gives unfair advantage to the Irvings." And I will table that for the benefit of the House, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're used to seeing. Mr. Speaker, the Premier is so determined to convince us it was a loan on commercial terms. Well, Mr. Speaker, you go to your bank and you tell your lender that you want him to forgive your mortgage, and you'll find out how different this deal is from commercial terms. Mr. Speaker, so I'll ask the Premier, the same person that said he did not like backroom deals with the Irvings when he was in opposition, will he release the full contract, the deal between his government and the Irvings today?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, all of the material that was required was released, Mr. Speaker, and the Leader of the Conservative Party knows this. He also knows that Irving was the only company, the only Nova Scotian company in this bid, that the National Shipbuilding Procurement Strategy required the participation of the government. If not, they could not have won the contract. That is some 11,000 jobs, some more than $2 billion in tax revenue to the province. And you could go to any bank. You could go to any bank and you say to them, I'm going to borrow a certain amount of money, and then I'm going to pay you more than 30 times over, more than 100 times over, Mr. Speaker. I think any bank will take that deal.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. The Irving Shipyard and the workers of the Irving Shipyard are the best in the country, and they won that bid on their own. On their own. Not because the Premier was willing to lend them a bunch of money and then write it off. They won it on their own. It's an insult to the workers at the Irving Shipyard to tell them otherwise. Mr. Speaker, the Government of Canada is releasing their agreement with the Irvings, the umbrella agreement, with the consent of the Irving Group. Only in Nova Scotia do we have a government that won't release the details of the assistance they're providing to the Irvings. Mr. Speaker, it ought to be a condition of getting government support that you accept public scrutiny. The Irvings have said yes to that in Ottawa, but the Premier of Nova Scotia won't apply the same standard here. So I'll give him one more chance. Will the Premier release the file and all the details of his assistance to the Irving Group, yes or no?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we were first out. We released all of that information, the details of the assistance, to show what a good deal this was for the province of Nova Scotia. You know, Mr. Speaker, for more than 10 years, when the Conservatives were in power, they used the rebate program, they put in place grants, they tried to influence business to come to the province through these measures, but they were not as successful as we were, and I understand that troubles the Leader of the Conservative Party. But, Mr. Speaker, there are a few years that are of particular note, and they are, of course, the years when the Leader of the Conservative Party were actually the Chief of Staff for the Ham government. So I would like to table, for the edification of the House, the $35 million worth of loans loans, rebates that were given out while the leader of the Conservative Party was the Chief of Staff for the Ham government.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In November 2011, I joined the Premier and the member for Cape Breton West on a trip to Ottawa to try and clean up the MV Minor mess. This is a very dangerous situation, Mr. Speaker. We have a derelict bulk carrier rotting off the coast of Cape Breton. To make things worse, the miner is located on a protected wilderness area known as Scattery Island. My question to the Premier: why is the MV Minor still floating in the rough Atlantic waters, and when will we be finally rid of this boat?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, as you know, this happened as a result of an accident at sea. I assume it was an accident. Nobody would deliberately allow a former bulk carrier to float ashore. The trouble is, and I pointed this out time and time again, is that the federal government does not have in place appropriate rules with respect to the towing of salvage in Canadian waters. There was no insurance on the vessel to ensure that there was a cleanup. There were not, in my view, inspection rules that were appropriate. There were not, or if they were appropriate, they weren't appropriately followed. Mr. Speaker, we have raised this, as the member opposite said, we have raised it directly with the minister. We have raised it with the various members of the federal cabinet, and yet all of the pleas that we make with respect to the federal government to clean up a mess that they allowed to happen have gone unanswered.
Honourable member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the reality is this is a disaster. It's an absolute albatross off the coast of Scattery, a protected area. And the issue for Cape Bretoners, it's not where the jurisdiction lies. It's not who's going to pay for it. The reality is this is an absolute mess off the coast of Cape Breton. And we need an answer. And as of right now, the province is responsible for oversight of this cleanup. As of right now, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The honourable member for Glace Bay has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, the Premier talked about a year ago about how this would be under control and we would make sure that this boat was removed. However, now we're over a year later, 13 months later, there are still liquids and floatables on the ship, and the province is overseeing the cleanup of the MV Minor. So my question to the Premier: can the Premier commit today to having salvage and removal activities at least resume before January 1st, 2013?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, salvage by their very nature require a salvage company who decides to undertake salvage. That is not the responsibility of the province of Nova Scotia, and I don't think that that students in our schools or that people needing assistance in medical care, I don't think that we should be taking money that we need to support education, health care, and other services should be taken in order to pay for something that is the responsibility of the federal government. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is yelling as usual because, you know, he doesn't understand. And I realize that he's never had to deal with these kinds of things, and he doesn't have the experience that is required in order to be able to understand them. But this is an important issue to people, and we are working hard to try and get it resolved.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, again, the people of Cape Breton are growing extremely tired and frustrated with this derelict ship that is rotting. And when the winter hits and the oceans crank up this winter, I don't know if there's going to be anything left of the MV minor. So it's certainly a concern. And the Premier's talking about federal jurisdiction, and he's talking about Bennington Group have shirked their responsibilities. But the reality is this is an absolute mess. The people of Nova Scotia, the people of Cape Breton, are looking to the province and looking to the Premier to clean up this mess. So my question is simple. When will the Premier finally stand up for Cape Breton, for Scattery, the protected area, and all the people of Nova Scotia, and get this boat off of our coast?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I led the team that went. I invited along the critic for the Liberal Party and the critic for the Conservative Party because I believe that the cleanup of this area is of all party concern, that it is not, in fact, a partisan issue. It is an issue of trying to make the federal government understand what their responsibility is and to live up to that obligation, not only to the people in this room, but most importantly, to the people in Cape Breton.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on a new question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, in response to our caucus's privacy concerns, the Economic Development Minister tabled an NDP communications brochure. The document outlines no legal guarantees, is void of legal details, and does not outline any controls whatsoever, Mr. Speaker. The document promises, but does not say how the government and IBM will deliver on those promises. So my question for the Economic Development Minister, will this minister table today the actual contract signed with IBM that outlines measures to protect our personal information and privacy?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to pass that on to the lead minister on that file. Go ahead.
Honourable. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for an opportunity to speak to this question. Mr. Speaker, the privacy is the utmost consideration for this government when we're dealing with personal information of people who either work for our province or work in entities like school boards or health authorities, or if in fact they're in receipt of various government programs and supports. The particular contract that the member makes reference to was subject to a review, an external review with respect to privacy and protection of privacy considerations. And Mr. Speaker, we went through all of the very rigorous assessment that is required to ensure that the data will be as protected in the future as it is currently under provisions in the provincial government, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Economic Development Minister thinks Nova Scotians should trust his government's ability to protect personal information. Yet this government's own legislation violated privacy law. Considering this government's record and IBM's past of secret deals to send personal information offshore, let's look at what the company will have access to, Mr. Speaker. Addresses, banking information, and, of course, social insurance numbers. Mr. Speaker, that's all the information needed to take someone's identity. This could make identity theft easier, and this government did not consult the privacy officer on this. So my question to the Minister of Economic Development, does the contract with IBM allow for cross-border access to the information on Nova Scotian-based servers?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to pass that on to the Minister of Finance, the person responsible for the SAP.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the information remains here in Nova Scotia. The information, any information that will be used in this process will be masked. And, Mr. Speaker, the standards are as high, if not higher, than the information that the processes that we use all the time in terms of protecting of information, Mr. Speaker. So I want to assure Nova Scotians that they have nothing to worry about with respect to the privacy considerations raised by the member.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with $100 million on the table of taxpayers' money and the contract directly with ERDT, I would hope that the minister would be able to answer some of the details on such an important and such a large relationship. That's right. The member suggests I don't understand it, Mr. Speaker. I certainly do. I understand what's happening here. Mr. Speaker, as I'm sure the minister knows, there's a difference between where servers are located and where people who can access those servers. IBM has entered into a deal with the UK government to allow offshore access to personal, confidential information, Mr. Speaker. The NDP claims a private consultant they used to prove the deal, but we have not been shown the report by that consultant and of that consultant. Mr. Speaker, we don't want empty promises. We don't want promotional material. Nova Scotians want and deserve access to both the contract and IBM and the report by the consultant. So my question, will a minister commit to tabling actual contracts today and reports instead of NDP promotional material where Nova Scotians' personal, confidential information is at risk?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, the honourable member demonstrates he either doesn't know or he willfully doesn't want to know, perhaps because of his inexperience, that these...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Finance has the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I indicated, the protection of personal privacy is of the utmost importance to this government. And we ensured, as we went through this process, that every protection that currently exists would continue to exist with respect to the way in which information is handled as IBM transitions the process of managing the SAP work of the government, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Premier told us that he is, quote, sick and tired of watching the future of Nova Scotia being sold off. But oddly, he didn't feel that way when he was writing big checks to companies like Daewoo, the Stern Group, Resolute Forest Products, the Irvings, and others. Mr. Speaker, what Nova Scotians are sick and tired of are paying for his expensive corporate welfare. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier, in light of the fact that after all of those hundreds of millions have been spent, there are still 7,400 Nova Scotians who lost a full-time job today compared to 3 years ago. Will he now commit to stopping the opening of the taxpayer's checkbook and spending so much money on corporate welfare?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, you know, speaking out of both sides of your mouth is never attractive. You see, on the one hand, while he was the Chief of Staff, he approved some $35 million in rebates, Mr. Speaker, because he could not instill the kind of confidence that was necessary in order to be able to ensure that we actually got the kind of attention from the business community that we are now getting. You know, the reality is that we have a very successful business attraction and retention program that has even through, and this is, I think, a very key point, something that the Leader of the Opposition doesn't understand or doesn't want to understand, and perhaps the Leader of the Conservative Party as well, which is that we have just gone through 3 years of one of the most difficult global recessions since the Great Depression, Mr. Speaker. And yet, despite all that, we are still managing to create jobs. We are still managing to attract new employers into the province, Mr. Speaker. That is, in fact, the hallmarks of success.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Premier may feel that he has grabbed the attention of the corporate community, as he just said. Of course he has. Anytime you open the taxpayer's checkbook and ask how much, you're going to get the attention of the corporate business community, Mr. Speaker. But
fill in the blank check.
The Premier's not alone. Of course, Mr. Speaker, yesterday the member for Queens, a member of his caucus, said, and I quote, "A company without ties to this province could potentially strip all of the forest lands here with no value to the province." And I'll table that quote from Hansard for the benefit of the House. And so my question to the Premier, who is this new boogeyman so intent on screwing the forests of Nova Scotia that he is using to try and justify another $100 million in bailout money?
I was just going to say that that word is definitely unparliamentary. Thank you. The Honourable. Order. Order, please. Order. The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that that Resolute, unfortunately, has gone out of business in Nova Scotia. They have closed that facility. So they put up for sale all of the assets that they have. Who purchases them, I suppose, is a matter of speculation. The simple fact of the matter is that there are unlikely to be buyers within the province. So the most likely result of that would be that it would be purchased from outside of the province. We know that there have been prospectors in through the province looking for these kinds of assets because they would want to buy them, take them out of the province, and then process them. The member for Clayton Park says carpetbaggers. Well, I don't see them necessarily as being malicious. They are looking out for their best corporate interests. We understand that, Mr. Speaker. We understand the relationship that exists in a market economy. But we also understand, Mr. Speaker, that it is the members on this side of the House that are charged with the responsibility for standing up for the people of Nova Scotia, whether they are in Queens County or in Port Hawkesbury, Mr. Speaker, and we intend to fulfill that responsibility.
The Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, of course, we all in this House feel a responsibility to all Nova Scotians. The difference is that the Premier feels that the best way to show it is by using their money to own lands like these lands in question in government hands. Well, the rest of us know that we should look for a responsible buyer, inside or outside, that can manage those lands to the benefit of all Nova Scotians, past and present.
Right.
What is most reprehensible, Mr. Speaker, is that a source close to the government yesterday tried to tie the sale of those lands to whether there will be money in the pension plan of the Bowater workers, Mr. Speaker, which is an awful way to try and force people to accept another $100 million check written by the NDP government, because, as we know, Mr. Speaker, amendments to the Pension Benefits Act in 2007 ensure that where there are assets available for sale, that the proceeds will go to fulfill the moral and legal obligation of a company to fund its pension plan. And so my question to the Premier is, will he stand in his place now and assure those pensioners that he will enforce the law regardless of who buys the Bowater lands?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I've been crystal clear on that, and that is exactly what we intend to do. But that is not the most reprehensible thing, as the member of the Conservative Party has said. The most reprehensible thing to do would be to follow the course of action that he suggests and simply wipe your hands of the whole thing and tell the people of Queens County, of Lunenburg County, of Shelburne County, of Annapolis County, you're on your own. Well, Mr. Speaker, he may want to desert the people of Southwest Nova Scotia. We will not.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government spent $60 million to create 60 jobs at the STN. We know DSTN's wind turbine business is struggling, and we know they are rushing to diversify, Mr. Speaker. Daewoo doesn't seem like a company to rush and change plans on the fly. Nova Scotians and the people of Pictou County are concerned about this investment and about this project. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Economic Development Minister, or whoever he punts it to, is there any part of the contract with Daewoo that commits them to staying in the province of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased. I'm pleased with the relationship that this government has with DSTN. Mr. Speaker, we've signed an agreement with DSTN, the parent company, Daewoo, world-renowned, known around the globe as one of the top shipbuilders in the world. They've diversified in other areas, Mr. Speaker. We are proud. We are proud as Nova Scotians to have this company as a partner for the good people, the province of Nova Scotia. Now, I know, Mr. Speaker, that the member from Glace Bay doesn't recognize that, Mr. Speaker, but we are proud. We believe in Daewoo, we believe in DSTN, Mr. Speaker, and we are moving onward and upward, Mr. Speaker. Onward and upward.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. DSTN has said, quote, "We, DSME Trenton, have one of the highest costs of manufacturing in the world," end quote. They have the highest overall tax burden, the highest corporate tax rate, and highest power rates of any province in Canada. Those factors weigh on any business, especially a struggling business. So my question to the Minister: in this minister's daily briefings with DSTN, what concerns around the cost of doing business have they raised, and how many Nova Scotians are employed at DSTN today?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
You know, Mr. Speaker, same question, same answer. Is that, yes, there are less than 60 people employed at DSTN. But, Mr. Speaker, we are hopeful. We are working with them. They have diversified. They are searching out new markets, Mr. Speaker. We believe in this company, Mr. Speaker. What the member doesn't understand, and that's probably lack of inexperience, is that to make money, Mr. Speaker, you've got to invest money, Mr. Speaker, and that's what we are doing. We are investing in Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think I understand this whole file and these issues much better than the Minister, so I'm proud of my lack of inexperience, as he says. Over the summer, the Economic Development Minister said, given the current market conditions, he was not sure if they would have made the same decision now, investing in Nova Scotia. That sounds like a company worried about its investment, Mr. Speaker. That means this government should be concerned about this investment, Mr. Speaker, as of course the taxpayers of this province are very concerned that we're spending $60 million with returns much less than what we thought we would be. More importantly, it means that this minister must become more forthright with Nova Scotians and the company that we partly own, Mr. Speaker. So my question for the minister: has Daewoo shown any hesitance about staying in Nova Scotia, or even hinted that they are interested in selling their 51% stake in DSTN?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, unlike previous governments, we have a plan for the future of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that is a long-term plan. It's a long-term commitment. And, Mr. Speaker, we have a plan. We have a plan, Mr. Speaker. And if the member hasn't heard it before, I'm going to say it again and again. And it's jobs here, Mr. Speaker. Jobs here.
The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Some kind of public forum is needed to heal the deep wounds and divisions and get to the bottom of questions surrounding the past of the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children. In a scrum, the Minister of ERDT indicated that he had been, at one time, a member of the Board of Directors for the NSHCC. That raises important questions of why he's involved with discussions about the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children, whether there should be a public inquiry and potentially cabinet discussions about lawsuits. My first question is to the Minister of Community Service, whose department is responsible for the relationship with the NSHCC. Has she been able to produce annual reports to establish when the Minister of ERDT served on the Board of Directors, and will she table the appropriate report or reports?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services. You have the floor.
Mr. Speaker, this is actually an issue that's in the court system, so I'm going to pass this over to the Justice Minister where the question belongs.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issue surrounding the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children for Coloured Children is one that raises concern and emotion, and it requires that we allow the processes go forward. And the member knows, as the Minister of Justice, that I can't talk about ongoing aspects of the investigation. I can assure the member that we take all allegations and aspects of this matter seriously. We will continue to be progressive in trying to find out answers and address it through that format. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our information, Mr. Speaker, is that it appears that the Minister would not have been a member of any time more recently than the mid-1980s. Of course, we know the serious allegations of terrible events taking place at the home extend until the early 1980s. It's very important for Nova Scotians to know that the Minister was not there during that time. He would not be able to be part of those discussions if this were true, nor would he be speaking as a cabinet minister, which appeared to happen in Scrum yesterday, or last week. Especially not only because the Minister of ERDT cannot say when he was on the board. Can the Minister of Community Service assure the House that her colleague clearly removed himself from all discussions, including at Cabinet, about the lawsuits involving the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children and the province, and associated challenges, including whether there should be a public inquiry in order to avoid a potential conflict of interest?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, as my colleague just mentioned, this is a terrible situation that everybody in the province is dealing with. And I think that it's highly inappropriate that that party tries to politicalize something that they were in existence. They were around the same time these issues were happening, the same as the Liberal Party was around. So I don't think that this is a situation that I'm going to speak of, because it's in the court system and it's very hurtful for many people, and those on the other side should have that kind of respect for the individuals that are going through this. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My final sup is to the Premier. Has he or his staff had the occasion to speak directly or indirectly to the Minister of ERDT to advise him that he should not participate in government discussions about the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children? Or should he speak on the file as a minister, unless it becomes clear that he is not in a conflict of interest, given that the minister himself cannot say whether he was a board member or that it is not clear at what time periods would be probed by an inquiry?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I can say is this, is that the allegations that are made around the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children are extraordinary, and of course the people involved, whether they are the claimants or whether they are the defendants, have the right to have that process go through the due process of law. That means to have them make the allegations, to substantiate them, to before what is a system that has been put in place, literally, Mr. Speaker, since Runnymede, where both a claimant and a defendant can stand before an arbitrator, an impartial, independent arbitrator, and have their claims heard. That is what this province is committed to, because those are the very hallmarks of justice.
The Honourable Member for Halifax, Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the federal finance minister indicated that global economic weakness has led to falling commodity prices and tax revenues. The federal government is telling Canadians that they're going to have to wait longer for a balanced budget. My question is for the Minister of Finance. Does the minister still believe that she can deliver a balanced budget this spring?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I provided the budget update back in the early fall, I reaffirmed we are on track to a balanced budget, Mr. Speaker, and I also indicated that we were watching the trends around the globe of slowing economic activity. We were aware, as most people are, of the problems in the American economy and in Europe, and we were watching these trends very carefully. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to watch what is occurring, and Mr. Speaker, there will be an update to the province's forecast in December, as usual. And at that time, we will be able to provide more detailed information about where we stand.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
The provincial government relies heavily on the fiscal payments from the federal government for such things as health services, social services, housing and infrastructure, and more. The federal government is clearly facing tough fiscal challenges and is already downloading some costs to the province, as seen in the changes to the Canada Health Transfer. However, we've heard nothing from this Premier and nothing from this government when these changes were being made. Will the minister tell Nova Scotians why her cabinet did not directly challenge the federal government's changes to the Canada Health Transfer?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, we know the Liberal Party has difficulty hearing good news from the government about all of our job creation plans, but apparently they also have difficulty hearing when the Premier hosts premiers from across the country, and they make equalization and transfer payments the focus of their discussion. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, the Premier and the Premiers will be meeting here toward the end of the month, Mr. Speaker, to deal with these matters. Mr. Speaker, the economy is...
Order. The Honourable Minister of Finance has the floor.
Thanks so much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we all know that there's been a recession, that the recovery from the recession has been extremely slow. The recovery is still fragile. The American economy is very important to what will happen in the Canadian economy, and they are facing some financial challenges of their own inside their elected assemblies, Mr. Speaker. All of these things are things that we will have to watch. But one thing that I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, the things that are within our control, our own spending, Mr. Speaker, our own work to create jobs in this province are on track, Mr. Speaker, and they are going very well.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, there are some pending and potentially dangerous changes that are coming from the federal government, and we know that equalization changes and the changes to that formula are among them. We have a population that is aging disproportionately to the rest of Canada, and our numbers are not strong as well. We need more people in this province. We simply can't afford more cuts to federal transfers. This government has been too quiet on changes to the old age security and didn't directly challenge the government on the Canada Health transfer. My question to the Finance Minister is, what is this government going to do to make sure that Nova Scotia doesn't lose out yet again when it comes to equalization changes?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much. Well, Mr. Speaker, the question demonstrates the inexperience of the member and of the member's party, Mr. Speaker. We all know, Mr. Speaker, that the leader of the opposition doesn't have any experience with respect to dealing with the federal...
Order. Sit down. A little heated in here this afternoon. I'd suggest that we just take a little bit of time to relax and get back to a good parliamentary debate. And let's, when the Speaker says order, that means order for all sides of this House to be quiet. So the next time I say order and somebody else is speaking, they could be out of the chamber for the remainder of the day. And that's the last warning. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to be a social worker. The last time I checked, social workers have every bit as much ability to take leadership roles.
Order. The Honourable Minister of Finance has the floor.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the economy in this country has experienced a very difficult recession and recessionary pressures. Those are not going to go away easily, Mr. Speaker. We have been through a very difficult time, and we know that we need to control the things that we can control, Mr. Speaker. Those things are our own expenditures, which we have done a very good job on, and we will continue to maintain discipline on that front. We will continue to invest strategically where we need to invest in job creation in this province, something that those job terminators have no time for, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia's manufacturing sales for August dropped 8.6% from the same month last year to $829.8 million. That was the worst performance in the country, Mr. Speaker. All other provinces posted increases except Quebec. July manufacturing sales were down 16.8% compared to the same month last year. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of ERDT is, why is the rest of the country outperforming Nova Scotia so significantly in full-time job recovery and exports?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I recognize the question from the member from Cape Breton. And we talk about our economy. And, you know, I wonder if the member has ever spoken to or written a letter to the cousins in Ottawa, the federal government, because, Mr. Speaker, we know what's happened in the province of Nova Scotia. And, Mr. Speaker, let's take Cape Breton alone. Let's take the cuts to Service Nova Scotia, the call centers. Service Canada. You have to excuse me, Mr. Speaker. I'm a little shook up right now. But what about the closure, Mr. Speaker, of Canada Post in North Sydney, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, what about the closure to Veterans Affairs Canada office in Sydney, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, while their federal cousins are cutting jobs, we are creating jobs, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like some proof of what jobs have been created in Cape Breton since this government's come in power. Mr. Speaker, this NDP are in power now for 3 years, and in the last 3 years, total exports dropped 16.2%. Energy product exports decreased 88%. Forestry product exports decreased 57%. Metal ores and non-metallic mineral exports decreased 55%. Manufacturing and exporting are vital to our province's economy and GDP. Nova Scotians deserve better than this NDP. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is, why does the minister refuse to admit his plan isn't working and will he get on with the hard work of actually making our economy better?
The Honourable Minister of Economic, Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we need some people to get out of the way. And, so that we can get on with the job at hand. And, last week, a significant week for the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just alone with projects in IBM, Mr. Speaker, when this agreement is finished, we will realize, after incentives, after rebates are paid, we will realize $13 million to the good, Mr. Speaker. $13 million that we will reinvest in roads, Mr. Speaker, that we will invest in education, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm not even going to mention the hundreds of millions of dollars that projects in IMV are going to IBM are going to initiate just in salaries alone, Mr. Speaker. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, the member over there is hollering because I made an error with IMB. Big deal. It's a sign of the times when it should be IBM. We all know what we're talking about, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this government has created a mess in the province of Nova Scotia. Imports are down 37.4%. Exports are down. That is a symptom of a very sick economy, and people are struggling as a result. So my final question to the Speaker is, will the minister admit his economic experiment didn't work, and will he stop picking winners and losers in businesses and get on with the hard work of making the economy better for everyone?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I got up on my feet and I talked about some of the cuts that the Conservatives federal cousins were doing out of Ottawa. And, Mr. Speaker, what about Parks Canada? What about Fortress Louisbourg, Mr. Speaker? What about Bell? What about the Alexander Graham Bell Park, Mr. Speaker? What about closure, Mr. Speaker, of the DFO office? They don't like to hear that, Mr. Speaker. What about the closure of the DFO office in Bedeck, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, what about service reduction? What about service reduction? Canada Revenue, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they are killing jobs, Mr. Speaker, while we are creating jobs.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on October 14, 2011, the former Minister of Health and Wellness provided the 2012-2013 budget targets for district health authorities, stating she wanted to allow more time for planning. And, Mr. Speaker, I will table that press release. At that time, a 3% reduction in DHA budgets was announced. Could the Minister of Health please indicate whether the 2013-2014 budget targets have been provided to the district health authorities, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The first thing I want to say is I want to thank all the men and women who are working extremely hard in the district health authorities across this province to ensure that we live within our means, Mr. Speaker. We can't be doing business the way we've been doing businesses for 20 years here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. And healthcare is extremely important because it consumes a large portion of our budget, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to work with everyone in the district health authorities across the province to ensure that we both that we live within our means, but ensure that the services that we provide Nova Scotians in healthcare are there for them, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's one of the best non-answers that I've received so far, my time in the House. Now, we'll try round two. Could the Minister please indicate whether the 2013-2014 budget targets have been provided to the district health authorities, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're working extremely hard with everyone within the healthcare system to ensure that not only do we come within budget, but also ensuring that the services are there, Mr. Speaker. We're changing the way we're delivering health care here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. We recognize that it's difficult for the Liberal Party to recognize that we needed to change the way we did health care here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, because the last time they were in government, they made a mess of health care, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I see the current minister is getting a little encouragement from the former minister, now known as the Minister of Disappointments. Wait times have gone up. The most seniors waiting for long-term care beds ever in the history of the province. And the chief police in Kentville still waiting for a reply for over a year. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'll ask again. Could the minister indicate whether the 2013-2014 budget targets have been provided to the district health authorities, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure which one to answer because he was all over the map on that. I have no clue what he's talking about with someone waiting for a year for a phone call, Mr. Speaker. But I can assure the member over there that we're doing something different. We're doing something different than when the Liberals were last in government, Mr. Speaker. Do you realize, Mr. Speaker, that when the last time the Liberals were in power, they wanted to take $600 million, borrow $600 million to pay off the debts of the healthcare authorities all across this province, Mr. Speaker. And not only that, Mr. Speaker, do you know when that health investment fund would have been paid off? It would have been the year 2012, 2013, Mr. Speaker. We're not doing it that way. We're doing it the responsible way. We're working with district health authorities to ensure that we make sure that the investments are sound, Mr. Speaker. We're not going to do it the Liberal way, Mr. Speaker. We're going to do it the right way.
The Honourable Member for Preston.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Environment. In December of last year, the Department of Environment issued a boil water order to Mountain View Estates in Lake Echo. This means that more than 356 families have been out living with this for the last 11 months. This has been a long, frustrating, and expensive 11 months with little or no progress. Mr. Speaker, is the Minister aware of the situation facing the 356 families, and how long has been aware of this situation?
The Honourable Minister of Environment.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And to the member opposite, any time that you bring a certain case to this floor, I welcome that. But after the question period, I'd be more than willing to sit down with the member opposite and discuss this particular issue one-on-one. Thank you very much for the question.
The Honourable Member for Preston on his first supplementary.
Well, that's a very disappointing answer. I wrote to the Minister. I'm sure the residents of the Mobile Home Park are going to be very satisfied with that answer, considering I wrote to the Minister many months ago in this regard. Mr. Minister, these 356 families have been quite patient, but faced with a situation for 11 months. Their patience is wearing thin, and they are not impressed with the many delays. Residents have received monthly boil orders from the park's owners, but there is a number of applications and permits which are involved in drilling wells and connecting to the distribution system. Obviously, it has taken far too long for this process to run its course. Mr. Speaker, what steps is the Minister currently taking in order to ensure that the 365 families have their drinking water restored immediately?
The Honourable Minister of Environment.
Well, thank you very much again, Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite. I think, first of all,
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of the Environment has the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, to the member opposite, I think Nova Scotians want to know that their drinking water is safe and clean. Is something that we take very seriously. I thank the member opposite for bringing this question here. Again, I'll repeat that any of these cases that I'll meet one-on-one, and I fail to see the lack of importance of this particular meeting. I'm willing to meet with the member opposite to discuss this file, and I think we take this issue very seriously, and I thank you for the question. I don't see what's wrong with that response. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Preston on his final supplementary.
It would have been interesting if the Minister would have answered my letter that I sent to him many months ago. Mr. Minister, for these residents, the last 11 months have been including boiling water for drinking, preparing formula for babies, brushing teeth, and cooking. Many families are spending their hard-earned money purchasing clean drinking water when water is included in their leases. The 356 families have been dealing with the high cost of having to buy the water for their daily needs. High costs which add up over the course of almost a year and have put a significant financial stress on 356 families. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister tell the over 356 families when they can expect to have their drinking water restored?
The Honourable Minister of Environment.
Well, thank you again, Mr. Speaker. To the member opposite, I wish the member would table the letter he's referring to. Again, I want to just emphasize again that we take drinking water very seriously, and it's something that we want to work with, whether it's municipalities or individual communities. We take this issue very seriously, and I encourage the member to attend that meeting, and I'm here looking in the best interest of all Nova Scotians. Thank you for bringing that question to the floor, and please table the letter. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week I was encouraged by the Minister of Community Services announcement surrounding the discussion paper on the Nova Scotian housing strategy. Reading through the document, it would seem that the government and this minister understands the fundamental needs of Nova Scotians when it comes to their housing needs. In a quote from the press release, the minister says, "We know that when people can choose housing that's right for them, they are healthier, better educated, more self-reliant, and our communities are more vibrant." So my question to the minister, Mr. Speaker, through you, is does the minister honestly believe that someone in receipt of a shelter allowance of $535, including power, on income assistance has a real choice at finding housing that is right for them?
Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, we're absolutely thrilled and excited that we're the government that's bringing the first housing strategy to the province of Nova Scotia. And we're going around the province to talk to the people of Nova Scotia, unlike the Liberals who do not want us to do that. But we want the opinions from people in our province. And I've spoken to the member opposite before with respect to the shelter rates, that the difficulty with that is that we have to realize that when you increase those shelter rates, that on the other hand, what usually happens is that their rent goes up. So we have to be innovative and creative in how do we go forward and offer more supports. And that's exactly what this government has done. That's why we have invested over $300 million in breaking the cycle of poverty and offering such things as the affordable tax credit, the poverty reduction tax credit, allowing people on income assistance to be able to work and keep more of the money that they earn. The list is very extensive, Mr. Speaker, so we know by what we've already done and what we're going to be doing that we are going to be helping people in this province have the option of the housing that they want. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the simple fact, the reality of the fact, when it comes to poverty tax credits, when it comes to the affordable tax credit, people's rents are rising every month. People's power bills are going up every month. Food costs go up every month, Mr. Speaker. These folks cannot wait 3 or 4 months for a check to come in the mail when they have to pay their bills monthly. Mr. Speaker, the discussion paper calls for a housing first model for homeless people, especially those with chronic illness, disabilities, or mental illness. Now, I understand, Mr. Speaker, that through a recent provincial initiative, more than 200 Nova Scotians who were experiencing homelessness now have a safe place, and that's good, Mr. Speaker. In a recent press release, the minister stated, the real measure of success of this project is the fact that we have helped 200 men and women break the cycle of poverty, and I can table that press release, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, does the minister honestly believe that someone who is in receipt of income assistance, who is living with mental illness, disabilities, and addictions, who lives on a government-funded income of $9,276 per year, with an annual rent allotment of $6,420 of that going towards shelter, given a fair chance to overcome their illness, seek out employment, be active in their community, and have a real chance of deciding where they want to live? Is this, Mr. Speaker, what the minister deems as breaking the cycle of poverty?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, this particular government has done more than any governments over decades and decades in terms of helping people break the cycle of poverty. It's difficult, it's challenging, but we're the ones who have taken up this challenge because we care about the people of Nova Scotia. We care about those individuals who are struggling. Not like the former Conservative government. Their answer to breaking this cycle of poverty was increasing the income assistance by maybe $3 to $4 a month. The Liberals' answer to breaking the cycle of poverty was cutting back on dental programs for children, the ages of the children that could receive those programs, to cut back, roll back on salaries. That was their poverty reduction strategy. It is this government and this minister who have committed to breaking that cycle of poverty. And I can tell you there are people throughout all of Nova Scotia are so excited that this government has taken upon themselves and made a commitment to a housing strategy. Neither one of those parties ever had the initiative or the commitment to do that. It took an NDP government to do that.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can sadly admit to the House that in my 7 years as an MLA, I've never seen the people of Nova Scotia and my community struggling the way they have since 7 years ago. And it's under this government that they're struggling, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the last shelter allowance increase was in 2006 by the then Conservative government. Last week, in an article in the Chronicle Herald, it was cited that young professionals are even having difficulty finding affordable housing here in HRM. Mr. Speaker, the housing consultation and the subsequent strategy is needed and required, and we're looking forward to it. But with rising food costs, rising power rates, rising rents, people on income assistance are having great difficulty even getting by, let alone overcome illness or seek employment. Mr. Speaker, can the minister tell the House if she's engaging in budget discussions with her cabinet colleagues around increasing shelter allowance for those in receipt of income assistance?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, what we're doing is we're traveling the province to talk to Nova Scotians, to talk to stakeholders, to talk to people that are experiencing that poverty. And we're providing wraparound services and support such as Housing First. And we are the the government that has made this commitment. The other two parties over there never had a plan. No plan at all. Everything was on an ad hoc basis. And if you want to reflect and talk about poverty, there has been poverty in this province for a very, very long time. And it was not until the NDP stepped foot on this side of the House that these issues have been looked at seriously. These issues have been committed to by developing plans and strategies. We're going forward and doing something. We have invested well over $300 million to date, and that is a lot of an investment, and we're going forward with more. What did they do? What's their poverty strategy? Was to do absolutely nothing, and that's basically what they did.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. On November the 5th, plans which would see the elimination of 2 mobile breast screening units from the Nova Scotia breast screening program were announced. And we know that their usage was decreasing. We know that it was old technology that's being replaced with new, more reliable technology. And those, Mr. Speaker, are very positive moves. However, my question to the Minister is this. Women living in northern Nova Scotia did not have access to any mobile screening unit during the entire 2012 calendar year. So my question to the Minister is this. Is it really acceptable for those women in northern Nova Scotia to have been denied that access for 1 full year?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank you for the question because no question breast screening here in Nova Scotia is an important issue, and it's something that was recognized a number of years ago that we needed to change the way we provided those screenings to women here in Nova Scotia. That's why I'm glad to say with the new release of the schedule for the mobile unit that every woman in Nova Scotia will have access to the more advanced digital mammography, Mr. Speaker, the first time in our history that we can have that. We recognize the importance of the mobile units, but there was a decision made almost a decade ago that we needed to ensure that people had access to fixed sites. So we went from having 1 fixed site in the province and 3 mobile units to today having 11 fixed sites, Mr. Speaker, and the digital mammography unit going around the province. And I hope Nova Scotians, especially women in Nova Scotia, recognize the importance of the breast screening program and obtaining those tests, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question was about the women in northern Nova Scotia who had no access at all for 12 full months to that particular service. And, Mr. Speaker, I would like to table a letter, and the Minister has a copy of this, from Joan Milliken, co-chair of Along the Shore Community Health Board. And this is a board that represents an entire rural area of the Colchester East Hants District Health Authority. And to quote from that letter, it has come to our attention that the mobile breast screening unit did not visit the communities in our area this summer. On contacting Marion Brine, the Nova Scotia Breast Screening Program Coordinator, she confirmed that the mobile unit did not go out into that area this year. The letter went on to state, those persons living in rural areas await the arrival of the mobile unit to support their health initiatives. So my question to the Minister is this. Why did the Minister fail to inform the Community Health Board that his government's decision to eliminate the Northern Mobile Unit would affect them directly?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
That's not the case at all, Mr. Speaker. The Nova Scotia Breast Screening Program has really moved in a positive manner to ensure that Nova Scotians can gain access to digital mammography screening here in the province, Mr. Speaker. We recognize, and it was part of the plan, and part of the plan of the committee that was together in 2005 to ensure that these fixed sites obtained the more advanced digital mammography screening units, Mr. Speaker. We recognized, but the mobile units were analog units, and they weren't as efficient, Mr. Speaker. And that's why we were taking them off the routes here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Often with women who obtained screening through these analog units had to be retested, and were often sent to a fixed site, Mr. Speaker. And I believe the fixed site up in that area of northern part of Nova Scotia now will service many of those clients. But ensuring that digital mammography unit gets around into those hard-to-reach areas, Mr. Speaker, is a key priority for us. And I look forward to the new route, which I believe will service the concerns of the members opposite in the riding that she represents. And we look forward to seeing that more advanced technology travel around the province so that all women have access to the more technical, advanced digital mammography screening, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issue was, there are two issues. One is the people in northern Nova Scotia had no access to that mobile unit for 1 full year. The second issue is the minister did not even inform through the Community Health Board those residents that they would not have that access. So there's two issues here. Certainly, an advanced technology is important, but there are many people, Mr. Speaker, in rural Nova Scotia who cannot get themselves to a site, and they do rely on the mobile unit. Mr. Speaker, Spring Hill, Tatamagouche, Bass River, Advocate, Parsbro, Sheet Harbour, Canso, you could go on. They're just a few of the hometowns of those women who saw no mobile service this year. In fact, that northern mobile unit did provide service to 22 communities in 2011 and no service in 2012. And in those rural communities, Mr. Speaker, rural communities throughout all of Nova Scotia, transportation often dictates access to services. And if those services are not readily available, Mr. Speaker, people just do not get the services they deserve. So my question to the minister is this. If you knew that you were not going to be using that northern mobile unit, and you knew that it was important, did you make any effort to reschedule the other mobile units so that they could give some service to some people in northern Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's important to recognize where we were and where we are when it comes to breast screening here in the province, Mr. Speaker. The member opposite should know. She should have been briefed when she was a health minister. This has been a process to get to today, Mr. Speaker. It's been a process to get to today where all women in Nova Scotia will have access to the more advanced digital mammography screening in Nova Scotia. We should be very proud of that, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotia is leading the way across the country when it comes to digital mammography, Mr. Speaker, not only in the fixed sites, but on the mobile sites also, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, on April 30th, 2010, the Director of Maintenance Enforcement Program sent letters to MLAs outlining the complaint process and giving contact information for MLAs dealing with the Maintenance Enforcement Program, and I'll table that. Subsequent phone calls, recent phone calls to many of these numbers revealed that many of the regional coordinators are no longer on their jobs. Could the minister please indicate when we might expect an update on this information?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that program is in transition, and there are going to be ups and downs as we progress in making the new adjustments. On her question that she raises here, I will look further into it and be happy to do so and get back to her.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, regional offices are no longer accepting checks. The offices in Kentville and New Glasgow are closed. There's no walk-in service in Dartmouth, Amherst or Sydney, and all MEP offices will be closed to the public as of January 1st, 2013. Happy New Year from the NDP. Mr. Speaker, 9,000 families are owed over $80 million in maintenance payments. How does closing regional offices where checks could be accepted directly and where both payers and payees could receive assistance, filling out forms, etc., improve the lives of these 9,000 families waiting payments?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the first thing I'd like to point out is that, if my memory serves me well, is that the party across, the opposition party, had complained about the inefficiencies, the poor quality of service, and that came out in various reports. And so we have taken steps. We have taken steps now to improve the system and make sure that it's more streamlined, that there's access to being approved. Having regional office in some communities and not in others was not a fair balance of the system, but bringing people together, training them and retooling and making the system more modern. However, I do see a difference between the Liberal Party. They're still stuck back in 20 years ago.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch-Cove.
And speaking of being stuck in the past, the government website still includes information that indicates regional offices are open for business. Nova Scotians are being asked on that site to be patient with maintenance enforcement changes. In fact, the site lists changes that people should, and I quote, watch out for. That's watch out for, not watch for, but watch out for. So 9,000 families are left to wonder as they wait for their $80 million in arrears payments, if the bank will be patient, if the landlord will be patient, if the power company will be patient. My question is to the Minister. If this consolidation of services will improve service to Nova Scotians, why are you asking Nova Scotians to be patient and to watch out?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll just simply say in regards to that is that any transition or remodernizing and improving the quality of the system takes a bit of a transitional change, and we're in that transitional change. And there are going to be some hiccups in the process, and we're working through to correct them. It's not a perfect world, but we are working to strive to make those changes, and we're very optimistic. We're moving forward that we will have a very sound, improved system to answer the very issue that you raised about getting dollars back into those hands of the people that need them. It's about putting families first. But if we continue doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome, that's the Liberal way. We believe in being progressive.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you will be to the Minister of Natural Resources. Or whoever you pass. Well, we'll start there anyway. Mr. Speaker, earlier today I was outside the chamber and I heard the Premier of the province tell the community that the MV Minor cleanup has stopped again. The Bennington Group are going to walk away, which is not the first time they've said that. They've said it on a number of occasions. The people of Manitou and surrounding areas have had this concern for quite a bit of time. And on a number of occasions, Mr. Speaker, they have written to the Minister of Natural Resources office to ask what Plan B was when the Bennington Group walked away. Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister of Natural Resources is what indeed can the people of Manitou now expect from his department in relation to the cleanup of the MV Minor?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly understand the honourable member's question and the concern that's being expressed from the community. We've been working as the Department of Natural Resources with the company from New York, the Bennington Group, and we've been, in fact, a year since they first contacted us. While we don't have a contract per se with them, we've been trying to facilitate, work with them to get through the laws and the regulations within the province, and it's unfortunate that they've decided now that they're going to walk away, but in reality, they're representing the owner, the Arvina Navigation Group from Turkey, and we've been trying to facilitate a way that they can get the shipwreck off of the Scattery Island. And as you know, I'm sure, honourable member, that the department has worked very, very hard to try to find a solution here, to try to find a way that that company can get that ship off the Scattery Island, and we're going to continue to try to find a way to make that happen.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much. And we already know what happened, Mr. Speaker. We were asking what's going to happen. What is Plan B? The people of Manitou deserve to know what Plan B is. And they've been asking that question time and time again, Mr. Speaker. Now, in a previous question from the member from Glace Bay, the Minister of Agriculture kept out hollering over there, that's a federal issue. It's a federal issue. Well, Mr. Speaker, when that minister and all of those ministers took their oath, they took an oath to serve the people of Nova Scotia. And the people in Manitou, Mr. Speaker, are people of this province. They're Cape Bretoners who deserve better than they're getting from this people. So the question, of course, is, when can the people of Manitou expect to get the same type of respect as Resolute and Stern and IBM and all of those other companies from outside the province? When is this government here? When is this government here, Mr. Speaker, going to look after Cape Bretoners and Nova Scotians instead of passing the buck off to someone else?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And certainly from the start over a year ago, we learned that the federal government did not properly ensure that there was insurance on that vehicle or that vessel, or no proper permits were in place. And really, we've been working with our counterparts in the federal government to ensure that they take their responsibility. They have, under Transport Canada, the full authority to have that vessel removed from the shores of Scattery Island. They have under the Canada Shipping Act, they have full authority to remove that vessel. And the honourable member has maybe better contact than I with the federal government. I would encourage him to contact his federal counterparts, ensure that they do live up to their responsibility.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I have been doing my job. I have been in contact with them in Ottawa. But, Mr. Speaker, that lot over there has not been doing their job.
Order. The honourable member for Cape Breton West has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this group over here, the Premier of this province, last October, said that if this doesn't get cleaned up, Nova Scotia will go it alone. We'll do it. We'll look after it. The people of Manitou and the people of Cape Breton deserve that to be done. Hey, you never said that. Well, there you go again, Mr. Speaker.
Someone else's fault.
It's always someone else's fault. This government over here, that Premier, can never take responsibility for their responsibility to the people of the province of Nova Scotia. They have a responsibility to...
Order, please. The time allotted for questions put by members to ministers has expired. I will now recognize the House Leader for the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Will you call resolution number 145?
Resolution number 1945. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise today and speak to the resolution before the House. And it would be hard to imagine, Mr. Speaker, a more timely resolution than the one that has been called for debate today. After all, Nova Scotians have now seen over 3 years of the great experiment of an NDP government, one that they elected, we all acknowledge they elected, with hope that things would be better, that things would be different.